Good morning, everybody. So happy to have you here. We're going to take a few minutes and let folks stream on in. We had over 600 people RSVP for the webinar today, so we want to give them plenty of time to join us. As you're streaming in, we'd love for you to drop your name and where you're zooming in from in the chat. So my name's Ashley Lukens, and I am a proud member of the Center for Food Safety team. I'm going to be your facilitator today, and I am zooming in from Honolulu, Hawaii. Hi, Ferndale, joining us from Michigan. Nice to see you. Hi, Barbara from Ashland, Oregon. So happy to have you here. Hi, Raven from Orangeville. Bridget from Phoenix. Everybody, welcome. So great to have you here. Ooh, two Bridgets. Hi, Kim King. Nice to see you. Chris from Texas. Chris, I'm from Houston. Happy to have a Texan in here. Good morning. Good morning, Wesley from Milwaukee. So happy to have everybody here. We're just going to take a few minutes and let folks stream in. We're dropping our names and where we're zooming in from in the chat. As you guys know, we're all engaged in this wild exercise of working from home. So apologies in advance for the delivery men and the dogs and just the regular life noise in the background. I wish we could minimize it, but it's difficult. Hi, Eileen from Lee Vining, California. I hope I said that all right. Hi, Homer from Portland. Wish I was in Portland right now. Hi, Marquita from Shaw, Dallas, Texas. Oh, Marquita Shaw from Dallas, Texas. Nice to see you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Susan from Vermont. I was saying as we were all hopping on the webinar, we had over 600 RSVPs today. So really excited that we have so many folks interested in this question of the role of pollinators in our food system and what kind of threat, how they're under threat. Good morning from Taos, New Mexico. Hi, Steve from Wyoming. Happy to have you here. So for folks who are new to Zoom, we're going to be participating actively in the Q&A. So if you look at the bottom menu of your Zoom, you'll notice that there's the chat where you're dropping in where you're from. And then you'll see there's another option for Q&A. So we'll be trying to monitor the Q&A throughout the webinar today. So you can drop your questions there and we'll try to answer them as we can. And we might have some time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. Hi, Mark from Maryland and every other state except Alaska. Mark, you should check out Alaska. It's amazing. Hi, Julie from California. Hi, Gail from Furcrest, Washington. Wow, just folks from everybody, everywhere. It's amazing. We're going to get started here. Again, my name's Ashley Lukens, and I am zooming in from Honolulu, Hawaii. And I work on the development team at Center for Food Safety and think a lot about how to bring resources into these critical fights. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jenny.
Hi, my name is Jenny Loda. I'm a staff attorney, and I've been working at the Center for Food Safety for about 10 months now. I'm based in Oakland, California, and I will pass it along to, I guess I'll give a little bit more of my background actually. So I've been an attorney for just about 10 years. I graduated in 2012 from Lewis and Clark Law School, where I studied environmental and natural resources law. And prior to going to law school, I actually worked for a number of years as a wildlife biologist. And I got a master's degree at Iowa State University, where I studied the impacts of some different elements of industrial agriculture like pesticides and fertilizers on amphibians. So pass it on to Omanjana.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, based on where you're joining us from. I'm Omanjana. I'm the staff scientist here at the Center for Food Safety, and I've been here at CFS for about a year now. Just like Jenny, I also went to graduate school, but I didn't get a law degree. I got a PhD in environmental science. And while I was in grad school, I focused a lot on issues of lead in the urban environment, especially in the soils in urban gardens, as well as in drinking water, which is a very persistent problem all across the United States. Here at CFS, I focus mainly on issues concerning the human health and environmental impact of pesticides on the environment. And my major work sort of revolves around making scientific information more accessible for all of our legal work, as well as for all of our members. So I focus a lot on like publicly engaged science work. And with that, I'll pass it on to Andy.
Thank you, Omanjana. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad everyone's joining us. And thank you, Ashley, once again for emceeing one of these webinars. You're great. And it's you always bring great energy to it. And I am Andrew Kimbrell. I'm the executive director and actually the founder of the Center for Food Safety. And this is our 25th year, if you can believe it. Time flies when you're having a good time. And I'm also an attorney. I do a lot of writing. And basically, I think the role of the Center for Safety actually began 25 years ago in defending the organic standards. It was during that when we first got started, there was an attempt during the Clinton administration by the then Secretary Dan Glickman to add GMOs, certain pesticides, irradiation, the use of sewage sludge into organic and make it acceptable. And we had been working for another organization I was working on those issues, but that was so urgent for us that that we said we have to do something about it. So we joined with our friends at the Humane Society and the Rural Advancement Foundation International, and we got about 300,000 people. In those years, you had to write in to the USDA. You couldn't no emails. You had to literally write in. So people had to take a real effort. And we created such a fuss that when the rules came out a few years later, and we threatened them with some legal actions as well, that all those were forbidden. And so since then, a big part of what we do is organic. We don't always talk about it on these webinars, but it's really the foundation of what we do. And we defend the standards, and it's a lot of work in that, as Omanjana knows, and our science team knows, and our legal team works. We're usually litigating and doing comments every year, many times, to make sure that the organic food that you find in the marketplace, that it has integrity. And that, as more and more people join organic, larger and larger companies go organic, which is great. But sometimes they'd rather change organic to what they do than change what they do to fit organic. And that's our job, to make sure organic has its integrity. And one last thing about organic is that at CFS, the Center for Safety, we view organic as not the ceiling of where we want to go with the future of food, but the floor, right? It's the floor. We need it. It's our basis. But above that, we want to build a food system that is local and appropriate scale and humane, very important for me, almost 10 billion animals we use. And then more than humane, also socially just and biodiverse and regenerative and climate friendly. So organic's the beginning. We're going to defend that ethic, and that's sort of our long range purpose. That's the purpose we hold to. And of course, we'll talk today, about pollinators, a critical part of our food system, and how those are threatened as well.
Andy, I'm wondering if you could kick us off, since you logged a few years at CFS, on some of the recent victories that we had, because I know 2020, 2021 were massive for us in terms of really actually seeing the culmination of some of the fights we've been engaged in at the regulatory level. Can you give a few highlights for the folks who are joining us and learning about CFS's work?
Yeah, there is a sort of, how can I put this, an unholy alliance between GMOs and pesticides. And we'll talk pesticides a little bit later, but what you folks may not know, that I'm sure many of you do know, is that 90+% of all the GMOs out there, they're not giving us more nutrition. None of them are. More nutrition, lower prices, more vitamins, a better flavor. They're actually there. They've been genetically engineered to withstand massive amounts of herbicides, right? And so they're sort of linked. So they plant this corn so that they can massively spray Roundup on it. Now, normally, if you spray Roundup on corn, it would kill all the corn. It kills anything that's green. But they've genetically engineered it so it doesn't. So now they can spread, Bayer/Monsanto can spread as much, they can literally, and they do, through air, through on their soybeans, some on their corn, you get air, right? So they literally are utilizing virtually every technology, put as much toxic herbicide as they can on those crops. And so one of the ways we stop that is to actually have the approval of the herbicide rescinded, right? In legal language, we have that registered, it's registered, and we vacate the registration, which just means an approval. And so once you do that, you've got not just stopped that herbicide, you've stopped the GMO whose purpose it is to withstand that herbicide. Hope that's sort of clear. So give you an example, the next generation after Roundup, which is becoming obsolete because weeds have adapted to it, is something called dicamba. Dicamba is one of the nastiest herbicides imaginable. They dropped that a long time ago when they started going with Roundup. Now that Roundup's obsolete, they're going back to dicamba. And what dicamba does under wet and warm conditions, it reconstitutes, it comes back up from the ground. It goes up into a cloud and it can travel 1 or 2 or 3 miles and then come down on your organic orchard, or come down on your organic field and destroy it. And it's been doing that to millions of acres across the country. So one of the most exciting victories we had was that we got the Ninth Circuit and the appellate court to say that that approval had to be vacated. So we took dicamba off the market. Now the Biden administration is trying to get back on the market, but that we took that dicamba off the market. So that didn't just say this really toxic and damaging pesticide that's ruining farmland across the country is off the market, but it meant that the next generation of GMOs that was dependent on being resistant to that is also off, right? There's no reason to buy those crops if the herbicide that they're designed to resist is gone. So, and then for those of you who are more legally minded, FIFRA, which is the act that regulates pesticides federally, didn't have a lot of teeth. But boy, we really put a lot of teeth into it with this precedent, because the court said, hey, EPA, when approving or reapproving a herbicide or any pesticide, you don't just get to use the studies of the company, which is what they did. They said, we don't have to look at data in the field, all these fields that are being destroyed by this drift. No, we'll just look at what Monsanto tells us. The court said, no way. You got to look at all that field data. And because you didn't, we're going to vacate your approval, right? And we've also had some very exciting victories, which Jenny can get into as well, on using the Endangered Species Act. You may not know this, but 75% of all endangered species that are listed are there because of farming and ranching. So the best thing we can do to restore the biodiversity that we've lost is by getting rid of industrial agriculture, which is, again, responsible for the majority of all those species. And we're using that law. We're using the Endangered Species Act, and in a very exciting victory, which was unexpected because it happened right at the end of the Trump administration, the Fish and Wildlife Administration said, you know what, we're going to go along with all the legal and all the scientific and all the years of work that you put into this CFS, and we are going to list the monarch butterfly, pollinator, as endangered. Now, we're not going to do it until 2023, which is coming, because we got so much of there's so many other endangered species on the list we got to deal with, but by 2023, we're going to do it. So, it's really one of the most rewarding things to see something as iconic and as beautiful as the monarch and say, we protected it.
Indy, I'd love for you to take a little bit of a step back. I was driving my daughter to school this morning at 6 a.m. and she was like, what's this big webinar you're doing? And I was like, it's on sort of the role of pollinators in the food system and the threats that industrial agriculture uniquely pose to them. So can you give folks on the call just a 35,000 view understanding of how critical pollinators are to our food supply?
Yeah, well, the elevator pitch, and it's accurate, is that 1 out of 3 bites of food that we take is there because of pollinators. And you're talking your fruits, your vegetables, nuts, all the things that a lot of that we rely on. And without the pollinators, they're not there. There's a new kind of insecticide that they're using. They're called neonicotinoids, and they're nicotine based, and they really attack the nervous system of the so-called pests they're going after. But these have been very, very damaging bees, for example. And they're also called systemic insecticides, and they're systemic because they're not sprayed. Remember talking about the aerial spraying? They're not or spraying. No, they actually are seed coating. So imagine the seed as kind of an M&M. And around it, you're coating, right? This is the systemic insecticide. It's very, very toxic insecticide. And when irrigation comes or rain, off it comes, and it gets sucked into the, by the way, into the soil, into neighboring streams, creates all sorts of havoc. But it also gets sucked into the plant, the corn plant, soy plant, whatever. It gets sucked into that plant. And now that toxic insecticide is in every cell of the plant. It might as well be genetically engineered because it's that time. And so when that plant is harvested and else happens, all those insecticides get out, and they're absolutely destructive. We did a study at CFS that showed that they were very ineffective, these systemic pesticides, insecticides on the pests they wanted, like the corn borer. They're very effective at killing pollinators, especially killing bees. We lost 40 to 50% of our bee population in 1 year between May 2019 and May 2020. Think about that. And almost entirely because of this new class of insecticides, which we are in litigation right now to stop. And because EPA doesn't even regulate them because they're seed coatings and not sprayed. So we are now in litigation against EPA saying you have to regulate them. But they're the most used insecticide right now, not just in America, in the world, and they're not even being regulated. So that's, you know, that's absolutely code red for us. We've got to get them regulated and get them stopped.
Thanks, Andy. Omanjana, I'm wondering if you can just expound on this a little bit about sort of what are systemic pesticides and what role they play in the industrial agriculture system.
Andy explained systemic pesticides really well. So pretty much if a product, let's say corn, for example, or soybean, is grown from a systemic pesticide-coated seeds, for example, neonicotinoids are coated onto seeds from which corn and soybean is grown, it means that that pesticide is literally in every single part of the plant system, including nectar, including the pollen that's a part of the plant. So when bees or butterflies, who are very important pollinators in food systems, actually feed or forage on this pollen and nectar, that enters their bodies. Neonicotinoids and other insecticides are very potent neurotoxins. So that means they attack the nervous system of the animal, of the insect, almost immediately. Aside from that, these chemicals can also cause damage to the flight of the butterfly or the bee, or how they reproduce, meaning that they cannot propagate or do any of the hive activities, which is very important for a part of our food systems, as well as the whole idea on how pollinators work is damaged. So it kind of like is a collapse of the entire system based on I guess I would say the ecosystem approach. Aside from that, when we talk of exposure to pesticides, we're also thinking of exposure to contact pesticides, which are different from systemic pesticides and somewhat, I think, more popular in how we think of pesticides when we look at pictures of how they're being sprayed aerially or through handheld devices onto crops. Systemic pesticides actually affect the part of the plant that they land on, which means if you're applying it to the leaf, it'll land on the leaf and stay there. If you're applying it to the shoot or the root, it's going to stay there. And bees, butterflies, and other insects who visit these parts of the plant are going to be affected by it. The harm more or less can be the same based on, I guess, the mechanism of toxicity of the product. And these differ based on the formulation of the product, as well as more specific active ingredient properties. I don't want to go too deep into the science, but more or less, they're all harmful. No good comes out of using pesticides in the agrarian food systems. Corn, soybean, which are grown from GM seeds, as well as grown from pesticide-coated seeds, are grown to withstand large amounts of these pesticides being applied on the food systems. It means that when you apply this pesticide, it won't damage the plant, but it damages all non-essential animals and plants that grow within of where it's being applied. It kills weeds, milkweeds in particular, which is very important for monarch butterflies to sustain and live on, as well as other insects and birds even who eat pesticide-coated treats suffer from damages. Lastly, I'll conclude by saying that all of the pesticide that remains behind in the land has the potential to get washed out into water bodies or to drift into neighboring fields, thereby extending sort of the range of damages that one can potentially think of when we're thinking of the scale of application. Dicamba drift in particular has been very, very prevalent, damaging about, I think, 30 to 50,000 acres of crops in certain states. And we've used that argument in many of our litigations in the past.
So what you're saying is that the agricultural model has been utilizing seeds that have been coated with pesticides that are sort of distributed through every cell of the plant.
Pretty much, yes.
And that as a result, anything that interacts with these plants is potentially exposed to these pesticides. Andy, what is the logic here? Like, why would a good Iowa businessman use this kind of product to grow corn or soy or any food stuff? Because my understanding is that neonicotinoids are used throughout our agricultural system, not just on corn and soy.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't think there's anything more symbolic of life than the seed. The seed has this, and in many cultures is sacred and probably should be. And, because of these seed coatings, studies have come out that shows that even just one corn seed, if eaten by a songbird, will kill that bird. And that if you accumulate just the amount that's put on, for example, on corn, just accumulate that, it actually can kill up to 60,000 bees. So we take something which is the symbol of life, and we've turned it into a vehicle of death. That is, and a death of not only things that are so important to our own survival, but are also so beautiful and so integral to the rest of the ecosystem. And why do they do it? Because there is a myth out there. There's a myth that has been one of the basic myths of industrial agriculture, and that is that we can somehow perpetually and permanently eradicate those particular plants we call weeds or insects that we view as pests or fungi that the monoculture the industrial system promotes, that we can get rid of them forever, right? Monsanto said that weeds will never adapt to Roundup. But we can use Roundup forever and kill weeds forever. And obviously that doesn't even pass the second grade. You'd fail your second grade science test if you tried that, right? So what we're seeing is now nature adapting. We're seeing that there's super weeds that Roundup won't kill, dicamba won't kill, 2,4-D, which is element of Agent Orange, won't kill. The plants have adapted, the insects have adapted, the fungi have adapted. We know that through our overuse of antibiotics now, we have antibiotic-resistant infections. We now have human fungi infections that resist. So there's this myth that somehow we could continue to have this blanket of poisons, right, spread it across the earth, and that we wouldn't create these super insects, super weeds that can resist them. The fact of the matter is that is a dead paradigm walking. They've run out. We're at peak herbicides. We don't have any new ones. We don't have any new fungicides. So this whole model, based on this sort of myth, this pathological misunderstanding of nature batting last, it's over. But of course, it still can do a huge amount of damage. And I just quickly add to that what's inspired me for many years in this work is the work of Rachel Carson. And it's 60 years ago, her Silent Spring came out. And in the last 2 pages of Silent Spring, she says, do not call them pesticides. Because as Omanjana was pointing out, they talk about non-target organisms, but that's a misnomer. They don't just kill pests. By using the word pesticides, it seems that somehow they're designed, just to go after that corn borer or go after that fungi or go after that so-called weed. But that's not it. They're biocides. They kill every living thing. They kill bees, they kill butterflies, they kill birds, they kill endangered species, they kill our children. So they're biocides, right? They are not carefully designed to somehow scientifically carefully. So I like to say pesticides/biocides. And I wrote a Huffington piece on this saying, let's call them what they are, biocides. And let's call what they do what it is, which is biocidal, killing diversity, killing life. So when you think of pesticides, just always think Rachel Carson, biocides.
Thanks, Sandy. So if we have an industrial food system right now that has been sort of at its inner workings designed for the increased use of these biocides, I'm wondering what tools we have at our disposal to stop it. And Jenny, as our staff attorney working both on endangered species and on sort of the broader range of biocide litigation, I'm wondering if you can talk about those regulatory levers that we have and kind of where we're at right now with regulating the pesticides that pose a really unique threat to our pollinators. Yep, did we lose her?
Maybe, are you on mute? Are you on mute, Jenny?
No, I think she's been having trouble. She's been frozen a few times.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now if I turn my camera off?
Yes, perfect.
My internet's being a little wonky. Yeah, so pesticides are regulated by the EPA under the FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So you can see why we call it by its acronym. So we often do litigation challenging these pesticide registrations under FIFRA, but FIFRA is not the strongest environmental law. Unfortunately, it does allow for a balance of costs and benefits by the EPA. So it definitely is not being super precautionary in terms of protecting human health or the environment. It's always a balance, but even within that balance, EPA very often gets it wrong and seems to just align itself with these companies. So that's why we bring these lawsuits. And so Andy mentioned before our dicamba victory, and that was one that was a major FIFRA victory. That was actually a big victory in terms of supporting the strength of that law. In addition, the Endangered Species Act is often considered our strongest environmental law, and so we often utilize that as well for pesticide challenges. So every time the EPA is registering a pesticide, they're required to do a ESA, endangered species assessment, to look at what are the potential impacts on threatened and endangered species, and do that assessment of these pesticides. And then assuming there might be impacts, they have to work with the expert wildlife agencies, the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, to fully assess those potential impacts, see if there are ways to mitigate for those impacts. But historically, EPA has completely ignored that duty. And so that's often been one of the challenges that we've brought to these registrations, is simply you need to do your job and do this Endangered Species Act consultation. And so that's something we continue to do and have been very successful on. And the EPA has actually now adopted a new policy where they're at least saying they're partly going to follow the law, because they've lost so many times in court. They're going to at least do some of this endangered species analysis in their work. And then getting back to FIFRA, Omanjana and Andy both talked about this issues with systemic pesticides and the seeds that are coated with these pesticides. Unfortunately, the EPA currently does not treat those as a regular pesticide registration under FIFRA. They essentially consider them to be exempt under what's called the treated article exemption. And so because of that, they haven't done anything to take a look at the risks of these these coated seeds, even though clearly they have really extreme risks. And so because of that, because of all these dangers and the fact that they're not even being looked at by EPA, in 2017, we filed a petition with the EPA asking them to either amend or reinterpret that treated article exemption that it's been relying on to avoid this regulation, and make it clear that these toxic seeds should be subject to the same registration and labeling requirements as other pesticides. So unfortunately now 5 years have passed and they haven't responded to our petition. But we're continuing to advocate on that. And so this past December, we filed a lawsuit against the EPA to compel them to respond to their lawsuit. And so that's still ongoing, and we'll definitely be providing updates in the future as we have them.
Yeah, I think something that I've realized working at CFS is just how long and drawn out this litigation is. All the while, these pesticides, these biocides are being applied liberally, sometimes without any restraint in our food system. And Center for Food Safety is there in the courts, just trying to get the government to do their job, which is to regulate industry for the benefit of our environment. And I think something else that's come up for me again and again when we talk about how we stop these companies is recognizing that the only laws we have on the books are about protecting animals and creatures and endangered species. We don't even have a robust enough statute to talk about the human health implications of these things. So we're using these statutes like the Endangered Species Act to try to get the government, the EPA in this case, to step in and do what they're supposed to do, what they're mandated to do, what they're chartered to do, which is protect our very finite and fragile ecosystem. Andy, I see you.
Yeah, I just, Jenny, on exactly that point, why don't you tell people about what we call our TRex victory recently, which is exactly getting to tell the truth and doing their homework. I used to, a judge once asked me, what's the problem with what EPA is? And I tell my kids, tell the truth, do your homework. EPA has done neither. And that's our job, is to get them to do that. Yeah, Jen, why don't you tell us about this strangely TRex? What does that mean? What happened?
Sure, yeah, so last summer, EPA authorized the registration of this new herbicide called trifludimoxazin. And because that's such a mouthful, we ended up coming up with the name TRex, which is actually based on the product name that they were registering called Tyrexor. And so this is another pesticide where EPA just did not do the Endangered Species Act analysis at all. They admitted so in their documentation. And even though, in their other environmental analysis they were required to do under FIFRA, they, admitted that this was a highly toxic pesticide to both terrestrial and freshwater plants, as well as to fish. And likely it's harmful to other things as well, especially when you get into these rare populations of endangered species, but they didn't take a look at that. So we sued to challenge them both under FIFRA and for their failure to do their duty under the Endangered Species Act. And because it was so clear cut that they failed to do the endangered species consultation, and they had basically admitted to violating that law, we filed what we call a preliminary motion to basically ask the court to vacate that decision simply based on that one law that they failed to consult. It's so clear cut. There's so many cases we've had in the past now to show support for this. And we had tried to talk with the EPA to try to negotiate initially a deadline, but they wouldn't give us any sort of timeline of when they would ever comply. So we went ahead and filed this preliminary motion. And as that went along, and before we got the responses in court from the agency, the BASF, which is the corporation that made this pesticide, they actually decided to go ahead and withdraw the registration. So they had been a part of the lawsuit as well. They joined the lawsuit to try to support the EPA. And yeah, I think they just saw the writing on the wall that there have been so many losses on this so far. And this was a very clear-cut violation. And so rather than, try to continue fighting it, they simply pulled the registration for TRex. And so now, this pesticide has never actually even gotten on the market yet. So this was a big victory, and not a traditional court victory with a judge making a decision, but more just these other parties realizing, the tables have turned against them. We've won so many times that they can't keep fighting this.
Andy, I'd love for folks who are tuning in, there's something really important to know about this litigation process. I think a lot of people imagine that we're like going up against the pesticide manufacturers. It's like CFS versus Monsanto. But oftentimes we're suing the government to do their job. And then the corporations join the side of the government to try and defend the government from not doing their job. So can you talk a little bit about that sort of litigation process, and also all the money on the side of these companies, and sort of what might we muster as a public interest, people-funded law firm that's oftentimes doing this work for free on behalf of butterflies and bees?
Yeah, not oftentimes.
All the time.
Yeah, we're pro bono, folks. Without you out there, all we're talking about doesn't happen. The butterflies don't get protected. We're pro bono. We just, we're not paid by any, there's no big pockets there. It's all you wonderful people. I want to quickly, I'll get to that in just a second. I just want to note though, for everybody out there, because FIFRA is so weak, it's so weak, and because GMO regulation is so weak, courts have held in our lawsuits, including one in Hawaii, that any state out there can say no to any pesticide. So you organizers listening, you folks who want to work at the state, and certain states even allow localities to say no. So when chlorpyrifos is again just a terrible biocide that affects the learning ability of children, when the federal government had not yet, it finally has, but we got bans passed in various states, including California and Hawaii. So remember, you can go because, yeah, sure, the corporations got what they wanted, a very weak federal law, but they got what they didn't want, which was the power of every state, and in certain states, localities, to say no to any pesticide and no to any GMO. So states and some localities, some states preempt their localities, but some don't. I believe Maine does it, for example, does not. So localities in certain of these states, but also at the state level, you can say no to any pesticide or GMO you want. So that's a huge amount of work that can be done, and it is. We do it, and our colleague organizations do it, and so even though we're trying to make the feds do their job, we can also work at the state and local level to make sure that happens. And so that's very exciting work. We've all loved it. Ashley, you've been involved in that in Hawaii and elsewhere, so it's great. As far as the other thing, yes. So what happened was, when the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, because of Rachel Carson's phenomenal work, really, sadly, after, she fought through all the maligning of the chemical companies while she was fighting cancer, terminal cancer, finishing, Silent Spring, published in '62. So, but because of that, she's sort of the mother of the environmental movement. We got the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, a new form of FIFRA, National Environmental Policy Act, almost everything that we litigate under. So the idea was that we would litigate against the government when it didn't do its job, just as you were saying, Ashley, right? And that's what we did. I've been doing this since 1986. So that's what we did. But around 20 years after that, corporations said, they're winning a lot of lawsuits against the government for not doing its job. So what we want to do, we want to intervene. So Monsanto says, you approve my Roundup. Uh-oh, they're suing you because you didn't do your job looking at endangered species or at human health impacts. We're going to intervene in that case. And courts more and more let them do it, and now it's routine. So not only are we suing EPA, but very, very quickly, those corporations come in. So if you can follow our lawyers into the courtroom, everyone listening, we don't just look over and see an EPA lawyer. We talk with them. Hey, how's it going? We know it's tough. You got a lot of stuff going on at the agency. Maybe you're doing like a Trump administration. And it's pretty depressing. I get it. No, we're looking over there. There's like 2 or 3 of us, and there's like 17 of them. Bayer's there, Syngenta's there, BASF is there. They're top lawyers from the top law firms in the country. And the government lawyers pretty much stay quiet. And so we get briefs. Yeah, the government opposes our briefs, but then we get briefs from Bayer, from Monsanto, Bayer, from Syngenta, and we have to respond to those too. So we're not just taking on the government when we win these victories, we're taking on the biggest multinational corporations in the world.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like us to hone in a little bit on Monarchs next, because I think they're a really, like you said, just a really beautiful and prized part of the South and North American ecosystem. Omanjana, can you talk a little bit about our monarch work and why are monarchs disappearing, and how does the industrial food system play a role in their disappearance?
So there are two main causes of monarch disappearance. The first and the most important one is the fact of that their food system is being lost. So monarchs most exclusively feed on milkweed, various species of milkweeds, which is found in and around their range. Milkweed destruction is being caused by relentless application of pesticides, primarily glyphosate. Because a majority of the crops grown in the US in the habitat of the monarch, which very coincides with the Corn Belt, actually now we grow GMO corn and soybean in that, which means you can apply as much pesticides as you want. You can spray as much glyphosate as you want. Nothing will happen to the corn and the soy plant, but every other thing that sort of present in that ecosystem that is not the corn and the soybean is going to be wiped out. And that is how milkweed is being completely wiped out from these areas. Monarchs, which feed on milkweeds and need the nectar from that, now don't have enough milkweed to sustain themselves on, and has sort of been directly responsible to in the declining numbers that we've recorded. A second, the reason I think, and a more important one, is the fact that its habitat is being lost as we are sort of decimating natural areas, prairies, and places where they were abandoned to include more land for agriculture, or even developing these highly urbanized areas with not a plant in sight. They just don't have enough space to move around and graze. Both the eastern as well as the western monarch populations have been affected by habitat destruction as well as loss of milkweeds. And in the litigation work that CFS has done, namely by being one of the litigators on the Monarch Petition, that there has been an extensive citation of scientific evidence and research pointing towards this fact, which showed that glyphosate use is directly tied to declining monarch numbers.
Thanks, Omanjana. Jenny, can you give us an update on where we're at with our Monarch petition, and maybe help folks understand just what it takes to list a species as endangered?
Sure. So for the monarch, was all the way back in 2014 that we filed a petition to protect them under the Endangered Species Act. So the federal agencies don't do a great job these days of actually listing and protecting endangered species on their own. So we often have to utilize a citizen petition process. So anybody can petition to protect a species under the ESA, assuming you have the right elements. So we filed this petition with some partners in 2014. Technically, the ESA requires the agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service in this case, to respond within 1 year to decide whether it will propose it to be listed or not. And but that unfortunately does not happen much. So in 2016, we actually filed a lawsuit to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to respond. So this kind of goes in this pattern that Ashley was talking about. Often we're just having to file lawsuits just to get them to even do their job and responding. And so at that point, we settled that lawsuit with Fish and Wildlife Service for a timeline for that decision. And as Andy mentioned, in 2020, they did announce that the listing was scientifically warranted to be protected, I believe, as a threatened species. But unfortunately, that's not an official listing yet. So they have this process where they sometimes say species are warranted but precluded, which essentially means they've decided there are other species that are waiting for protections that are taking higher priority, and they just don't have the resources to do all of them. So they did say that they plan to propose it in or finalize its listing in 2024, assuming it is still warranted at that time. So right now it's considered a candidate species, which means it doesn't technically have all the protections of the Endangered Species Act. But when agencies are doing ESA consultations, like when we force EPA to do consultations on pesticides, they are expected to consider these candidate species with the presumption that they will be listed. But I'll just add, it takes many years often to get species protected, but just filing the petition itself can produce a lot of action. And I think that's been seen in the Monarch with the petition, and also advocacy that we and other groups have done around it has really pushed the public to know more about the species, to understand the importance of planting milkweed and not using pesticides that might harm plants like milkweed that they rely on. And so even just getting that process started, I think can get a lot of push. And sometimes states suddenly pour a lot of money into protecting the species because they may not want the federal listing. And ideally the species improves enough that it doesn't need a listing, and that would be great by us. But right now, unfortunately for the Monarch, it does look like it will likely still need protections by 2024.
Go for it, Andy.
Yeah, I just want to say that many states, I don't know if all do, maybe Jenny, you know, but I know most states have their own endangered species legislation. And so again, for folks out there, you don't always have to work at the federal level, particularly if it's not looking great in Congress after November. Great work can be done at the state level. We're doing that right now with trying to protect insects, including monarchs in the state of California, which up to this point does not have insects as part of its endangered species protection. We're trying to make sure it does. So we're in litigation there. So there's lots of things you can do in your local and state area. We like to hit the feds too, but we also, it's really important to do that work. I also just, when we're talking about monarchs, and I think I have this right, but on their westward migration, I think it's at least 2 and maybe even 3 generations. So they'd eat the milkweed as that's, when one generation dies, not only are the butterflies then reliant on the milkweed, that's actually how they become alive, right? And then they somehow know how to go west. The great wisdom of how in the world a species like monarch and a totally new generation knows exactly where to go is to me one of the most miraculous things in nature. And it's so again, it's just so poignant and emotionally disturbing when something that's that symbolic of life and the magic of it is killed by Roundup, because it's killing not just milkweed, by the way, just about every flower out there in the Midwest. So the bees don't have those to pollinate on. I mean, milkweed is the most iconic because of monarchs, but they're killing almost everything out there that any pollinator would use. So again, instead of a culture of life, we see these biocides bringing us a culture of death, and we're doing everything we can to stop that.
So we've been talking a lot about the threats posed by systemic pesticides, pesticide-coated seeds, namely neonicotinoids. We've been talking about the rise in GE crops and how it kills sort of species like milkweed, which endanger monarch habitat. We haven't really talked about the threats posed to human health, which we know are difficult to litigate. But Omanjana, I'm wondering if you can talk about what the effects are on human beings that are living in and among these agricultural systems where these biocides are being used.
I think there's been sort of like, a direct linkage to some of these pesticides affecting human beings by causing, fatal diseases like cancer. Glyphosate, for example, has been linked to causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is sort of a form of cancer that begins from your lymph nodes and sort of attacks the white blood cells of your body, making it defenseless. And Andy or Jenny can answer to this, better than I can. The fact that there has been many cases filed linking insurgence of cancer amongst glyphosate applicators. And I believe there have been many settlements too in the past few years. But definitely, aside from the big bad cancer effect, there are many small systemic effects in our systems too, which don't often show up as we are exposed to these pesticides, but accumulate over our lifetime, affecting literally every single organ of our body, because humans can be exposed to pesticides through direct ingestion, through our noses, through our skin. So literally no part of our body is safe. And of course, through drinking water, because a lot of these pesticides get washed out to water bodies which we're drinking, and therefore can be exposed to children as well as adults.
Andy. Up, you're on mute.
97% of streams in the United States have some pesticide residue in them. Majority of rain has shown to have glyphosate in it. So the massive blanket of these biocides are everywhere in the environment. And I think particularly tragic is the very well peer-reviewed science that shows that many of them are neurotoxins and affect the neurological development of children. This was true of chlorpyrifos, and to me, those are always the most important and urgent to stop, because you could be affecting just, and it's really a war on our children in a certain way. I mean, to have these out there, and it's shocking that the government would allow that. But and ADHD, for example, as peer-reviewed science is associated with pesticide exposure. And then the other point I would make is that we have to remember that while the pesticide residue in our food, or biocide residue in our food, is dangerous for all of us, those in the front line of the farm workers. We have to, and we just passed Cesar Chavez Day, and we saw a wonderful CFS. We saw a wonderful documentary on Dolores Huerta and those activists, and they really were the first ones. They were sort of soon after Rachel Carson to say, what, you can't buy a grape ethically, morally, without thinking of the people that pick that grape and what they're going through. And so when we think of pesticide, and biocides, we need to realize that these farm workers, California and elsewhere, are really the front line of exposure, and quite often their families are living with them. So those children, they're getting it. So that in our most recent lawsuit to get rid of the approval of Roundup, we have those farm groups and farm worker groups on that lawsuit, and we just argued in court about the health effects on them. And I very much hope that the court will rule with us that those health effects make Roundup a biocide that no longer deserves any kind of approval or registration. So I think it's incumbent on us always to, when we're doing our work, and we at CFS can do more of it, but I hope our fellow organizations is to really do whatever we can to work very closely with the farm workers and those who are most exposed to these toxins.
Yeah, I remember when we were in the throes of the Hawaii litigation, I had this sort of aha moment when I realized, as individual consumers, there are things we can do to limit our exposure to neonicotinoids. We can try to work with our points of sale to make sure they don't use neonicotinoid coated seeds. We can choose to shop organic. But for communities working in and living around industrial agricultural operations, there's nothing an individual can do. I can't stand by my fence and say pesticides are not allowed to drift into my home on a windy day and be inhaled by my child on a daily basis. And when we think about exposure to these pesticides, it's not those acute events where you might smell it and taste it. It's the low level, daily, indiscriminate exposure, the chronic exposure that's leading to these negative health outcomes. And only the government can stop that. only the government can step in and do their job to regulate these substances, to ensure that they're not persisting in our environment and killing both the people and the species that we hold most dear. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got a very active conversation happening in the Q&A. So I want to kind of honor that and let folks know that if we didn't answer your questions, we're always available to communicate with you guys offline. You can drop your email in the chat. Brenna, I'm sure, can let everybody know how to stay in touch with us over the coming months. We are here because of you all, because of our donors, because of our action takers, because you're helping to buttress what we do best, which is really to be the legal science and organizational support that these species and these communities need to ensure that the government is doing what they need to do, which is protect both human health and our environment. I wanted to end with just a quick go around, and maybe I'll do Omanjana, Jenny, and end with you, Andy, about what's inspiring you. I know we talked about some pretty serious threats posed to monarchs and pollinators and humans today. What's giving you hope and what's keeping you engaged in this work? Omanjana?
I think the fact that all of us together can affect change and can cause change. It's so much easier to sort of, be in this together and sort of be a part. It's a community. It's a community of people, driven by sort of the same desire to create a better world for us, for our children, for the future generations. That drives me.
Me too. Jenny?
Yeah, I'm similarly inspired by all the people involved in the movement, and I feel like there is so much doom and gloom around a lot of this and a lot of things these days, and so it would be really easy to kind of give up and to say there's nothing we can do about the extinction crisis or the climate crisis, and just not try to avoid that. But we really can do things, and there are so many people that are involved. I'm inspired, daily by my coworkers and their continued passion for this work, and just in general for just seeing so many people, like just showing up here today that you have an interest in this is inspiring to me. And I actually just signed up for this new citizen science project in California to study our native bumblebees. And so, just knowing that there's people out there that they want to contribute to this work in some way, whether it's going out to a neighboring park to look for bees or to get more engaged in organizing. There's so much people can do, and it really just gives me hope that so many are still engaged.
Thanks, Jenny. Andy, you want to close us out? We got 2 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm very inspired by the people that work at CFS and some of our colleague organizations, especially the young people. It is, we get on in age a little bit. It's just great to see these generations coming up and so bright and so committed. It's great. And I would just quickly add that, if you look at pollinators is a really important part of our food system, right? But if you look at the essentials that it takes to grow our food, and you've got water, and you've got soil and seed and farmers and the sun and animals, every one of them is being devastated by industrial agriculture. We're destroying our soils past their ability to regenerate, our water past its ability to regenerate. The average age of a farm in the United States is 59 years old, highest rate of suicide. Sun's turned into an enemy with climate change, can't grow crops after 104 degrees. We've seen the devastation among pollinators. Animals have been put in horrifying animal factories that become methane lagoons that create the climate crisis. This paradigm is over. It's not like we're little David fighting the Goliath. Their entire system that's been around for 5 generations is completely unsustainable. It is a dead paradigm, and it's maybe a zombie paradigm, but we got to get rid of that paradigm as soon as possible, because we are the future. We're not sort of fighting kind of an edge battle. If there's going to be a future for the human race, and we're not going to take a whole bunch of the rest of the Earth community with us, we are the future. And that is how we approach our work. We have to get rid of this destructive paradigm as quickly as we can and replace it with organic and beyond, which is the future, which has to be the future.
A woman to that. We're grateful for all of you guys for joining us. Please stay in touch. we host these webinars quarterly, and we'd love to know some of the questions that you're curious about, so we can come on and answer. And just so many thanks to Omanjana and Jenny for joining this today. We're trying to do more to show you guys the hearts and the faces and the minds that are really driving this work at this organization. And we couldn't do what we do without both of you. So thank you for joining today. And we look forward to being in touch with all of you in the future. Thanks to Maria and Brenna for being the back end support on all of this. We're really grateful, and we will see you at our next webinar in 2 to 3 months. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you, Omanjana.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.